Hey guys, I'm Dyer. I'm going to be talking about the rise and fall of Detroit sports. I'm working on my self-isolating. I'm kind of in quarantine right now, so I'm just going to be delivering the speech to you guys. I'm recording this on my phone, so it's going to be a little tricky to flip the camera around, but I'm going to start my speech with a video here, so I'm going to have to flip it around. So without further ado, here we go.
The 1-0, swinging a fly ball, left field is deep. It's way back. The Tigers are going to the World Series. 3-run walk-off home run. Oh man, Odoji is around third. He's into a box-seat at home. The Tigers have beat the A's 6-3, completed a 4-game sweep.
Now that was one of the more iconic scenes in Detroit sports of the last 20 years or so. So let's talk about what made the Detroit Tigers good. The Detroit Tigers, they made the playoffs 4 times starting from 2000 on. That's what I'm going to be using the time period for all the teams. So from 2000 on, they made the playoffs 4 times in 06 and then 11 through 14. In 2006, they were just now bringing up rookies that have now become household names, such as Justin Verlander. They were massive underdogs in 2006. They'd just come off a season a couple years prior where they had almost set the major league record for losses in a season. Then the second stint, where they had become regular playoff contenders and championship contenders, they started to trade for bigger names such as Max Scherzer and Miguel Cabrera, who is a lot of people's favorite Tigers nowadays. That was the good, and then it starts to go downhill very quickly after 2014. Starting in 2015, they were under a very rich GM. He was in a very much win-now setting. Mike Ilitch was the president. He owned the Tigers. When he passed away, the Tigers were in a different state than they were. They were in a state where they could buy all the players that they wanted, essentially. He didn't have any money restrictions. He would just pay for all the players that he wanted, and the Tigers were very successful because of it. Now, they were paying a thing called a luxury tax, which caused them to, it's basically like a payroll, essentially. You can't go over a payroll, otherwise you have to pay an extra tax. So once they got tired of that, they were paying way too much money year after year after year. They were forced to either release the players or just bite the bullet and pay the contracts. And they were paying contracts for players that are now old, Miguel Cabrera, and they're just not getting the same production out of them now that they're older. They drafted fairly poorly. During the time where they were good, you're supposed to be building more prospects to be coming up, and they didn't hit on any of their first round draft picks. It didn't go very well. Where they're at right now, they're rebuilding. They've been rebuilding for about 2 or 3 years now, and they're doing an adequate job of it. Moving on, we're going to go to the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons were one of the more storied, the second most storied Detroit franchise. They made the playoffs 8 times, consecutive years actually. From 2001 to 2009, they went every single year. In 2004, they won the NBA Finals over the Lakers. They had a core of players that were very significant, very well known: Chauncey Billups, Tayshaun Prince, Richard Hamilton, Rasheed Wallace, Ben Wallace. They sort of built the mantra that it was the hardworking blue-collar guys that Detroit is kind of built off of. They were a very beloved franchise. The city loved baseball, loved basketball, loved hockey. Basketball was probably the second most favorite. They were a very, very loved franchise. And then after those players had passed their prime, they fell on hard times. They drafted arguably worse than any major sports franchise in any sport. In the 2003 draft, the first pick was LeBron James, pretty well-known name there. The second pick was somebody who you've never heard of unless you follow basketball very closely. Second pick was by Detroit. They drafted Darko Milicic. He was a European massive human being who was supposed to be a dominant center. He didn't pan out even in the slightest. I think he's in boxing now. The next 3 picks, they passed on 3 Hall of Famers: Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade. That set the franchise back exponentially. The Pistons, they've kind of been in an awkward stage of they didn't know if they wanted to rebuild or if they wanted to make a playoff push over the last 5 to 6 years now. This year they finally came to the decision after getting swept in the playoffs last year that they're going to rebuild. So they just started their rebuild. We'll see how it goes. It just started months ago, so we'll have to see how that goes. Moving on to the Red Wings now. The Red Wings are by far the most storied franchise in Detroit sports. They made the playoffs 25 consecutive years from 1991 until 2016. During that span, they won 4 Stanley Cups in 97, 98, 2002, and 2008. They had storied players such as Henrik Zetterberg and Pavel Datsyuk. They were very well known. This was during the non-salary cap era. They could basically do the exact same thing that the Tigers were doing because they were under the same ownership. They were paying for players, essentially. They could go out and get whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, essentially, because their owner was in a win-now mentality. After the Red Wings had switched, the NHL had switched to a different rule, they were forced their hand a little bit because they had to start making strategic moves. The NHL changed to a salary cap rule, which made you have to be much more strategic with your trades and such. Ken Holland was different. He was very much in a old state of mind where he wanted to just pay the players that were already in their prime, so he was paying them lifetime contracts essentially, and then they just weren't producing as much. It's the same deal as the Tigers. The Wings and the Tigers had a very, very similar structure. They were both paying players that were well past their prime. They were paying them oodles of money. That's kind of brings us to where we're at now. I mean, the streak just ended, 3-4 years ago now? They've been in a little short awkward stage, shorter than the Pistons' awkward stage, where they were trying to get back to playoff contention, and they finally decided they're going to cut ties with Ken Holland, the GM, and they hired a new GM, Steve Yzerman. He has came in, and he is starting the rebuild this year. So it remains to be seen what's going to be happening there, but a former Red Wing great, it's pretty easy to deduce that he should do an excellent job in leading the franchise. That's all we got here. Thank you.